Imagine a weapon so extraordinary, so outside the boundaries of conventional warfare, that when American sailors finally boarded one in August 1945, they stood in silence. They had captured enemy submarines before. They had examined captured aircraft. But this was something none of them had ever encountered, something that, by all logic, should not have existed at all. Beneath the surface of the Pacific Ocean, longer than a city block, wider than a locomotive, and carrying fully operational warplanes within its sealed hull, was the I-400. A submarine. An aircraft carrier. A single machine that blurred the line between two of the most dominant weapons of the Second World War. The year is 1942. Japan is at the height of its power. The Empire of the Rising Sun controls vast stretches of the Pacific, from the Kuril Islands in the north to the islands of Southeast Asia in the south. Japanese forces have swept through the Philippines, Malaya, Burma, and the Dutch East Indies with startling speed. The attack on Pearl Harbor has left the United States reeling, struggling to reassemble its naval strength. But the architects of Japanese strategy are not satisfied. They know something that their battlefield victories do not reveal. They know, as Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto knew from the very day the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, that Japan has stirred a sleeping giant. The United States is vast, industrially unmatched, and deeply resilient. A single spectacular strike, no matter how devastating, will not end this war. Something more is needed. Something audacious. Something the world has never seen. Yamamoto is the most strategically minded commander in the Imperial Japanese Navy. He has toured the United States. He has studied its factories, its railroads, its rivers and coastlines. He knows that attacking American military outposts in the Pacific is not enough. To truly shatter American resolve, to force a negotiated peace before Japan's resources are exhausted, you would need to strike the American mainland itself. Not with a fleet that could be tracked and intercepted. With something invisible. Something that could travel from the other side of the world without being seen, surface without warning, unleash destruction, and vanish again beneath the waves. That idea becomes the I-400 class submarine. Officially designated the Sen-Toku type, Sen-Toku, meaning submarine special, the I-400 series would become the largest submarines ever built in the history of naval warfare, a record they would hold for nearly 2 decades. They were not simply weapons. They were a vision of what war could become. A vision conceived in desperation, born of extraordinary engineering, and ultimately lost to the tides of history. This is the story almost no one tells. The story of the underwater aircraft carriers that could have changed everything, and the story of why they never got the chance. On January 13, 1942, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto formally submitted a proposal to Japanese Fleet Headquarters that would reshape the course of naval engineering forever. 6 weeks had passed since the attack on Pearl Harbor. The fires had barely cooled. And yet Yamamoto's mind was already racing past the victory, toward the problem that no one else was willing to confront yet. Japan's strategic position was fragile. The empire had seized territory at breathtaking speed, but it could not hold that territory indefinitely. American shipyards were beginning to surge with production. American carriers, lost at Pearl Harbor or in the brutal engagements that followed, would be replaced, and not one at a time, but in waves. Japan did not have the industrial capacity to match that output. If the war became a long war, Japan would lose it. Yamamoto's proposal was strikingly simple in its ambition. Build 18 enormous submarines unlike any ever constructed. Give each one the ability to carry multiple strike aircraft sealed within a watertight hangar. Give them range enough to travel from Japan to the western coastline of the United States and return without refueling. Then unleash them. Strike American cities. Strike American ports. Strike the Panama Canal, the vital artery that allowed the United States to move its Atlantic fleet into the Pacific. Create panic, chaos, and doubt. force Washington to divert resources to defending its own shores. And perhaps, if the strikes were damaging enough, force a peace. The proposal was reviewed, assessed, and ultimately approved. Captain Kamito Kurishima, one of the most creative strategic minds in the Japanese Navy, was tasked with transforming Yamamoto's concept into a detailed engineering plan. By March of 1942, the general design parameters were finalized. The requirements were unlike anything naval architects had attempted before. Each submarine had to be capable of circling the globe on a single load of fuel. Each had to carry no fewer than 2 attack aircraft, armed and ready for launch. Each had to withstand the crushing pressures of deep submersion while protecting the aircraft within. The resulting vessel was a marvel and a monster in equal measure. The I-400 class submarine stretched over 400 feet in length, longer than a standard American destroyer. It displaced more than 6,500 tons when submerged, roughly 3 times the displacement of a typical American fleet submarine of the era. The hull was constructed with a distinctive figure-8 cross-section, 2 cylindrical pressure hulls joined side by side, which gave the vessel its extraordinary width and allowed for the placement of fuel tanks massive enough to carry over 1,750 tons of oil. Along the top of the hull, running most of the vessel's length, sat the most distinctive feature of the entire design, a cylindrical, watertight aircraft hangar, 115 feet long and roughly 12 feet in diameter. Inside that hangar, folded and locked in place, were 3 Aichi M6A Seiran aircraft. The Seiran, its name meaning storm from a clear sky, was designed specifically for this role. Its wings folded back against the fuselage. Its tail fins could be collapsed. Its floatplane pontoons could be detached and stowed separately. A trained crew could take one of these aircraft from its stowed configuration, assemble it fully, fuel it, arm it, and have it sitting on the catapult launch rail in under 15 minutes. 6 men working simultaneously across all 3 aircraft could prepare the entire complement for launch in under 45 minutes. The submarine's armament extended beyond its aircraft. 8 torpedo tubes were mounted in the bow. Anti-aircraft guns studded the conning tower and deck. A catapult system along the forward deck could launch the Seiran aircraft using compressed air, sending them into the sky while the submarines sat at the surface. A collapsible crane mounted at the bow could recover returning aircraft from the water, though as the war progressed, recovery was increasingly considered secondary to the speed of diving back beneath the waves before Allied aircraft could respond. Construction began at the Kure Naval Arsenal in January 1943. The scale of the project was unlike anything Japanese shipyards had attempted. From the outset, the program faced severe resource constraints. Japan's wartime economy was already straining under the demands of fighting across multiple theaters simultaneously. Steel was in short supply. Skilled labor was being pulled in every direction. The original plan for 18 submarines was quietly reduced to 9. Then, following the death of Yamamoto himself, shot down over Bougainville Island in April 1943 in an American ambush, the program was scaled back further still. 5 submarines were ultimately authorized for completion. By the end of the war, only 3 would be finished: the I-400, the I-401, and the I-402. But even 3 of these vessels represented something extraordinary. Something the world had never seen. And the question now was not whether they could be built. They were being built, at enormous cost, at the edge of Japan's industrial capacity, under the shadow of a war that was slowly, inexorably, turning against the empire. The question was what they would be used for, and whether they would be ready in time. By 1944, the tide of the Pacific War had shifted decisively. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 had shattered the offensive power of the Japanese carrier fleet, sinking 4 of its finest fleet carriers and killing hundreds of irreplaceable aviators. The island-hopping campaign led by General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral Chester Nimitz was steadily dismantling Japan's defensive perimeter, one bloody atoll at a time. American B-29 bombers were beginning to range over the Japanese home islands. The dream of a swift, negotiated peace had faded into something much darker. It was in this context that the I-400 program took on a new and desperate urgency. The submarines that Yamamoto had envisioned as instruments of an offensive strategy, weapons to carry the war to the American homeland, were now being considered for a more immediate, more achievable purpose. The question was no longer how to frighten America into negotiating. The question was how to slow the inexorable American advance long enough to make any negotiation possible at all. The Panama Canal emerged as the primary strategic target. The canal was the central artery of American power projection in the Pacific. Through its locks passed the ships, the fuel, the ammunition, and the reinforcements that sustained the American war effort across thousands of miles of open ocean. If the locks of the canal could be destroyed, by aerial bombing from aircraft that appeared without warning out of the depths of the Pacific, the United States would be forced to route its entire Atlantic fleet around the southern tip of South America. The strategic consequences would be immense. Months of delay. Thousands of miles of additional sailing. A real, measurable slowing of the American advance. The plan was approved and assigned to Submarine Division 1, operating under the Imperial Japanese Navy's 6th Fleet. The division would consist of the I-400, the I-401, and 2 modified submarines from the AM class, the I-13 and the I-14, each capable of carrying 2 of the Seiran aircraft. Together, the 4 submarines could deploy 10 strike aircraft simultaneously. The attack would be led by Commander Tatsunosuke Ariazumi, a senior officer who had become the spiritual and organizational father of the entire I-400 program. He was a man of absolute conviction, deeply loyal to the Emperor, and utterly committed to the mission regardless of its cost. Through the autumn of 1944 and into early 1945, the submarines underwent trials, modifications, and intensive training operations. The crews of the 631st Naval Air Group practiced their procedures relentlessly. Launch drills were conducted by day and by night. The pilots, many of them veterans of earlier Pacific campaigns, flew simulated attack runs against model targets. Each exercise shaved seconds off the preparation time. Each drill made the machine more precise. But time was not on Japan's side. In March 1945, while the I-400 sat in dry dock at Kure, an American carrier task force launched a devastating strike on the naval arsenal. Aircraft from the USS Essex, the USS Intrepid, and the USS Hornet swept over the harbor. Anti-aircraft fire rattled from every ship and installation. On the deck of the I-400, a single gunner was killed, the submarine's first casualty, and a harbinger of the devastation being visited on Japan from above. By June 1945, the Panama Canal mission was reconsidered. The American advance had moved too close, too fast. Sending submarines halfway around the world to strike a target far from the active theater of war no longer made strategic sense when American forces were already launching air raids against the Japanese home islands from bases in the Mariana Islands. A new target was selected, one that spoke not to the strategic ambitions of 1942, but to the desperate realities of 1945. Ulithi Atoll, in the Caroline Islands, had become one of the most important Allied naval staging areas in the Pacific. At any given time, dozens of American warships rode at anchor in its lagoon, fleet carriers, battleships, tankers, troop transports, preparing for the next phase of what many now believed would be the invasion of the Japanese home islands themselves. 15 American carriers were reported anchored there. If those carriers could be destroyed or damaged, the timeline of the invasion might be pushed back. It might buy Japan the weeks or months it needed to prepare its final defenses. Operation Erasure, Mountain Storm, was the name given to the new mission. And in the summer of 1945, as Japan burned and its cities crumbled under the weight of American bombers, the 4 submarines of Submarine Division 1 began to move. On July 13, 1945, the I-400 departed Nanao Bay on the western coast of Honshu and made for Maizuru. The journey southward through Japanese coastal waters was a passage through a country in crisis. The skies above were increasingly owned by American aircraft. The seas around the home islands were prowled by American submarines. Every mile the Japanese vessels traveled was a mile traveled under constant threat. In late July, as the submarines rendezvoused and prepared for their final operational briefing, something strange happened aboard the I-400. The crew painted false American markings on their aircraft. White stars on the wings. American tail numbers. The logic was tactical. A disguised approach might buy a few additional seconds in the darkness above Ulithi before the Americans realized what they were looking at. But there was something deeply symbolic about the act as well. Japanese aircraft, flying under American colors, in a last desperate gambit to alter a war that was already decided. The strike plan was precise, if not exactly optimistic. I-13 and I-14 would sail to Truk Island, where they would offload 4 Japanese reconnaissance aircraft, the high-speed Nakajima C-6N Seiran, designated MIRT by Allied intelligence. These aircraft would fly over Ulithi and confirm the exact positions of the American carriers anchored there. That reconnaissance data would then be relayed to I-400 and I-401. The 2 larger submarines would then approach the atoll submerged, surface under cover of darkness on August 17, launch their 6 Seiran aircraft on a nighttime attack under a full moon, and dive again immediately after. The pilots would receive hormone injections to enhance their night vision. Each aircraft would carry an 800-kilogram bomb. The plan was not for the pilots to return. In the final desperate calculus of Imperial Japan's war strategy, these men were expected to deliver their bombs and then, if they survived the attack, to land their aircraft near the waiting submarines for recovery. But the possibility of recovery was understood by everyone involved to be secondary to the delivery of the bombs. The mission was sailing toward Ulithi when the world changed. On August 6, 1945, a single American B-29 dropped an atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. The explosion obliterated the city center and killed an estimated 70,000 people in an instant. 3 days later, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. Japan's military command, already shattered by years of attrition, staggered under the impact. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed the Japanese people in a radio broadcast, his voice heard by most of them for the first time, and announced Japan's acceptance of the terms of unconditional surrender. The war was over. Somewhere in the Pacific, still sailing toward their target, the crews of the I-400 submarines received the transmission. The order was passed down through the chain of command. The mission was cancelled. The war was over. And now came the most difficult order of all, surrender. For Commander Ariazumi, the man who had devoted years to building and commanding these remarkable vessels, surrender was a boundary he could not cross. As the submarines prepared to comply with the terms of capitulation, Ariazumi took his own life. His was not the only death in those final hours. Some of his crew, equally bound by the codes of honor that had defined their military lives, followed. The men who remained faced the extraordinary task of handing over the most secret, the most extraordinary submarines ever built, machines that had never fired a shot in anger, to the enemy. The Seiran aircraft were assembled, run out of the hangar, and launched unmanned from the catapult into the sea. The bombs were unloaded and sunk. Codebooks, charts, and secret documents were destroyed. The torpedoes were fired into the open ocean. The I-400 flew the black flag of surrender as it was intercepted by American destroyers, the USS Blue and USS Mansfield, some 500 miles northeast of Tokyo on August 27, 1945. When the American prize crew boarded the submarine and made their way through its passageways, into the vast aircraft hangar, past the catapult rail and the crane and the machinery of a weapon built to strike the American homeland itself, they were, by every account, stunned. Not a single intelligence report had warned them. Not a single codebreaker's intercept had revealed this vessel's existence. They were standing inside a machine that had come within days of launching an attack on a fleet anchorage they had considered secure. And they had never even known it existed. On August 31, 1945, at 0500 in the waters of Tokyo Bay, the American flag was raised above the I-400 for the first time. The enormous submarine, dwarfing every American fleet boat anchored nearby, sat in the harbor that had once been the heart of Japanese naval power. American officers and sailors made their way through its corridors, through its engine rooms and torpedo bays and the vast cylindrical hangar that ran nearly a third of the vessel's length. Many of them simply stared. The I-400 and its sister ship, the I-401, were brought to Sasebo, Japan, for initial examination. Teams of American naval engineers and intelligence officers spent weeks going through every inch of the vessels, documenting their design, their capabilities, their systems. The submarines were then sailed to Pearl Harbor, the very harbor that Yamamoto had attacked, the attack that had given birth to the entire I-400 program, for further study. The intelligence value of the I-400 class was immediately understood to be enormous. Here was a submarine with the range to reach any point on Earth. Here was a vessel that proved submarines could carry and deploy aircraft as operational strike weapons. Here was engineering that surpassed anything the United States, Britain, or any other Allied power had produced. The questions it raised were immediate and pressing. What else did Japan have that Allied intelligence had missed? What other weapons had been developed in secrecy, under the assumption that the war would last long enough to deploy them? The answer, in the case of the I-400, was both reassuring and troubling. The submarines had existed. They had been completed. They had been armed and crewed and ordered into action. But they had never fired a shot. Every mission planned for them, the attack on American cities, the destruction of the Panama Canal, the strike on Ulithi, had been cancelled, redirected, or overtaken by events. The I-400 had come to the edge of history and then stopped, frozen there by the sudden, overwhelming finality of the atomic bomb. But the Americans were not finished studying these vessels. And they were not the only ones who wanted to. The Soviet Union, now entering the war against Japan in its final days, formally requested access to the captured submarines. It was a request the United States had no intention of honoring. Soviet naval engineers examining an I-400 class submarine, with its revolutionary design, its global range, its aircraft carrying capacity, would have provided years of technical intelligence to a country that was already emerging as America's next strategic rival. The answer was simple. The submarines would be sunk. On June 4, 1946, the I-400 was towed out into the Pacific Ocean southwest of Pearl Harbor. 3 torpedoes from the USS Trumpetfish struck her hull in succession. She slipped beneath the surface and sank to the ocean floor, taking her secrets with her. Her sister ships followed. The I-401, the I-402, and the supporting AM-class submarines that had comprised Submarine Division 1 were all scuttled. The Cold War had not yet been given its name, but its logic was already operating. The wreck of the I-400 was located in 2013 by the Hawaii Undersea Research Laboratory, resting on the seabed off the coast of Oahu. The images that returned from the deep showed the massive hull still largely intact, the cylindrical hangar still recognizable, the catapult rail still in place, a ghostly monument to an idea that was, in its own way, ahead of its time. The I-400 class submarines had no operational impact on the outcome of World War II. They never attacked a single Allied ship. They never launched a single aircraft in anger. By that narrow measure, the measure of battles won and territory taken, they were a failure. The years of labor, the immense resources consumed, the engineering brilliance invested in them produced nothing in the end except 3 extraordinary vessels that were studied by the enemy, sunk to prevent a second enemy from studying them, and then forgotten by history for the better part of half a century. But that is not the only measure by which history evaluates a weapon. The I-400 class submarines demonstrated, conclusively and for the first time, that a submarine could be designed around the deployment of strike aircraft at intercontinental ranges. That a vessel could be built large enough, and sophisticated enough, to function as both an underwater warship and a mobile airfield. That the ocean floor was not merely a place to hide, it was a highway that could carry destructive power to any point on Earth without warning. The Cold War navies of both the United States and the Soviet Union took these lessons seriously. The development of the ballistic missile submarine, the most destructive weapon system ever deployed, capable of delivering nuclear warheads to targets on the opposite side of the world from beneath the ocean surface, owes a conceptual debt to the engineers and admirals who built the I-400. The idea that a submarine could carry and deploy a strategic strike weapon, that it could travel the world's oceans invisible and unsuspected and then surface to unleash devastation, was not invented by the Cold War. It was invented in the shipyards of Kure and Sasebo, Japan, in 1943. One Seiran aircraft survived the war. Found at the Aichi aircraft factory after Japan's surrender, it was shipped to the United States, stored for decades, and eventually restored through years of painstaking work. Today, it hangs in the National Air and Space Museum's Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center in Virginia, the only surviving example of the aircraft designed specifically to fly from the belly of a submarine and strike without warning. It hangs there in silence, a reminder that the line between the impossible and the actual is often thinner than we assume. The men who built the I-400 submarines were working against time, against dwindling resources, against a war that was already lost by the time their vessels left the shipyards. The men who crewed them were ordered to their deaths and then spared by events they could not control. The men who surrendered them, those who could bring themselves to do so, handed over a weapon unlike anything the world had seen, to an enemy who immediately understood its significance. The I-400 class submarines are not famous. They do not have the place in popular memory occupied by the Tiger tank, or the Zero fighter or the V-2 rocket. But in the quiet, technical history of naval warfare, the history written not in the thunder of battles but in the patient language of engineering and strategy, they occupy a place all their own. They are the machines that proved what was possible. The weapons that arrived too late for the war they were built to fight. The submarines that changed everything about how navies would think about the ocean, and about the nature of power hidden beneath it. History does not always honor the extraordinary simply because it was extraordinary. Sometimes the most remarkable things vanish quietly, sunk in distant waters, to lie in darkness for decades before someone finally goes looking for them. But when they are found, they remind us of a truth that every age of warfare rediscovers in its own way, that human ingenuity in the service of destruction has almost no limits, and that the weapons that never fire are often the ones that teach us the most.